The trouble appeared to be over Germany, which on February 11th, 1945, had been split at the Yalta Summit meeting into 4 zones: American, Soviet, British, and French. As the Russians had done the most fighting and suffered the greatest losses, it was agreed that they should have an early crack at reparations from Germany to the extent of $20 billion. At a later meeting at Potsdam, the new President Truman, with Stalin and Churchill, reconfirmed Yalta and opted for the unification of Germany under the 4 victorious powers. But something had happened between the euphoria of Yalta and the edginess of Potsdam. As the meeting progressed, the atom bomb was tried out successfully in a New Mexico desert. We were now able to incinerate Japan, or the Soviet for that matter, and we no longer needed Russian help to defeat Japan. We started to renege on our agreements with Stalin, particularly reparations from Germany. We also quietly shelved the notion, agreed upon at Yalta, of a united Germany under 4-power control. Our aim now was to unite the 3 western zones of Germany and integrate them into our Western Europe, restoring in the process Germany's economy, hence fewer reparations. Then, as of May 1946, we began to rearm Germany. Stalin went up the wall at this betrayal. The Cold War was on. At home, the media was beginning to prepare the attentive few for disappointment. Suddenly, we were faced with the highest personal income taxes in American history to pay for more and more weapons, among them the world killer hydrogen bomb. Why? Because the Russians were coming. No one knew quite why they were coming or with what. Weren't they still burying 20 million dead? Official explanations for all this made very little sense. But then, as Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, merrily observed, in the State Department, we used to discuss how much time that mythical average American citizen put in each day listening, reading, and arguing about the world outside his country. It seemed to us that 10 minutes a day would be a high average. So why bore the people? Secret bipartisan government is best for what, after all, is or should be a society of docile workers, enthusiastic consumers, obedient soldiers who will believe just about anything for at least 10 minutes. The national security state, the NATO alliance, the 40 years Cold War were all created without the consent, much less the advice of the American people. Of course, there were elections during the crucial time, but Truman, Dewey, Eisenhower, Stevenson, Kennedy, Nixon were of a single mind as to the desirability of inventing first a many-tentacled enemy, communism, the star of the Chamber of Horrors, then to combat so much evil, install a permanent wartime state at home with loyalty oaths, a national peacetime draft, and secret police to keep watch over homegrown traitors, as the few enemies of the national security state were known. Then followed 40 years of mindless wars which created a debt of $5 trillion that hugely benefited aerospace and firms like General Electric, whose longtime TV spokesman, Ronald Reagan, was eventually retired to the White House. Why go into all of this now? Have we not done marvelously well as the United States of amnesia? Certainly European bankers envious our powerless labor unions. Only 14% of the lucky fundsters are privileged to belong to a labor union. and our industries lean, mean, downsized, with no particular place for the redundant to go except into the hell of sizzle and fry and burn. Today, we give orders to every country on our globe, tell them with whom to trade and to which of our courts they must show up for indictment should they disobey us. Yet something omnious, as Darrell Zanuck used to say, no one ever corrected him either. Something really omnious is happening. We have come to what Tennessee Williams once called a moon of pause. When I asked him, what on earth does that mean, Tennessee? It is, he said loftily, the actual Greek translation of menopause. I said that the word moon did not come from menses, Latin, not Greek, for month. Then what, he asked suspiciously, is the Latin for moon? And I told him it was luna and all the fun that he might have. With the word lunatic, he sighed and cut. But suddenly, summer before last, at the Madrid conference about the extension of NATO, which Senator Lott has just said is of no interest for a debate in the Senate, a moon of pause seemed a nice dotty phrase for the change of life that our empire is now going through with no enemy and no discernible function. While we were at our busiest in the funhouse, no one ever told us what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was really about. March 17, 1948, the Treaty of Brussels called for a military alliance of Britain, France, Benelux to be joined by the U.S. and Canada on March 23rd. The impetus behind NATO was the United States, whose principal foreign policy, since the administration of George Washington, was to avoid entangling alliances. Now, as the Russians were supposed to be coming, we replaced the old republic with a newborn national security state and set up shop as the major European power west of the Elbe. We were now hell-bent on the permanent division of Germany between our western zone plus the French and British zones and the Soviet sector to the east. Serenely, we broke every agreement that we had made with our former ally, now horrendous communist enemy. For those interested in the details, Carolyn Eisenberg's, she happens to be in the room now, I'm told, Drawing the Line, the American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944-49, is a masterful survey of an empire, sometimes blindly, sometimes brilliantly, assembling itself, first its allies, and turning them and its enemies like Germany, Italy, Japan, into client states, permanently subject to our military and economic diktat. Although the Soviets still wanted to live by our original arrangements at Yalta and even Potsdam, we had decided unilaterally to restore the German economy in order to enfold a rearmed Germany into Western Europe, thus isolating the Soviet, a nation which had not recovered from the Second World War and had no nuclear weapons. It was Dean Acheson again who elegantly explained all the lies that he was obliged to tell Congress and the 10-minute attention span average American. This is gorgeous stuff, by the way. If we did make our points, this is Acheson writing in his memoirs, if we did make our points clearer than truth, isn't that glorious? Clearer than truth. We did not differ from most other educators and could hardly do otherwise. Qualification must give way to simplicity of statement, nicety and nuance to bluntness, almost brutality in carrying home a point. Thus were two generations of Americans conditioned by their overlords so that at the word communism, there is a Pavlovian reflex as the brain goes totally dead. In regard to the enemy, Ambassador to Moscow, Walter Bedell Smith, wrote in December 1947, apropos a conference to regularize European matters, "The difficulty," he wrote, under which we labor is that in spite of our announced position, we really do not want nor intend to accept German unification in any terms the Russians might agree to, even though they seem to meet most of our requirements. This is higher diplomacy. Hence Stalin's frustration that led to the famous blockade of the Allied section of Berlin, overcome by General Lucius Clay's successful airlift. As Eisenberg writes, with the inception of the Berlin blockade, President Truman articulated a simple story that featured the Russians trampling the wartime agreements in their ruthless grab for the former German capital. The president did not explain that the United States had abandoned Yalta and Potsdam, that it was pushing the formation of a West German state against the misgivings of many Europeans, and that the Soviets had launched the blockade to prevent partition. This was funhouse politics at its most tragical. The case for an American world empire was never properly argued since the debate, what little there was, centered on the alleged desire of the Soviet Union to conquer the whole world, just as Hitler and the Nazis were trying to do until stopped in 1945. On March 12, 1947, Truman addressed Congress to proclaim what would be known as the Truman Doctrine, in which he targeted our ally of 2 years earlier as the enemy. The subject at hand was a civil war in Greece, supposedly directed by the Soviet. We could not tolerate this as suddenly, this is his quotation, the policy of the United States is to support free peoples who are resisting attempted suppression of personal freedom. Thus, Truman made the entire world the specific business of the United States. Although Greek insurgents were getting some help from Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, the Soviet gave none. Russia stayed out. They still hoped that the British, whose business Greece had been, would keep order. But as Britain had neither the resources nor the will, they called on the U.S. to step in. Behind the usual closed doors, Atchison was stirring up Congress with Iago-like intensity. Russian pressure of some sort, he said, has brought the Balkans to the point where a highly possible Soviet breakthrough might open 3 continents to Soviet penetration. Senators gasped, grew pale, wondered how to get more defense contracts into their states. Of the major politicians, only former Vice President Henry Wallace dared answer Truman's clearer-than-truth version of history. Wallace said yesterday, March 12th, 1947, marked a turning point in American history, for it is not a Greek crisis that we face. It is an American crisis. Yesterday, President Truman proposed, in effect, that America police Russia's every border. There is no regime too reactionary for us, provided it stands in Russia's expansionist path. There is no country too remote to serve as the scene of a contest which may widen until it becomes a world war. 9 days after Truman declared war on communism, he installed a federal loyalty oath program. All government employees must now swear allegiance to the new order. Henry Wallace struck again. The President's executive order creates a master index of public servants, from the janitor in the village post office to the cabinet members. They are to be sifted and tested and watched and appraised. Truman was nervously aware that many regarded Wallace as true heir to Roosevelt's New Deal. Wallace was also likely to enter the presidential race of 1948. Truman now left truth behind in the dust. Here's his quote: "The attempt of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin et al. To fool the world and the American Crackpots Association, represented by Joe Davies, Henry Wallace, Claude Pepper, and the actors and artists in immoral Greenwich Village, It's just like Hitler's and Mussolini's so-called socialist states. Give them hell, Harry. In the wake of Truman's cuckoo-like emergence from the old-fashioned closet of the American Republic, a new American state was being born in order to save the nation and the great globe itself from communism. The nature of this militarized state was from the beginning beyond rational debate. Characteristically, Truman and Atchison insisted on closed hearings of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. These matters were too important to share with a people whose spare 10 minutes was now more and more filling up with television. The media spoke with a single voice. Time Life publisher Henry Luce said it loudest: God has founded America as a global beacon of freedom. He once said to me, the great task for the United States in the American century is the Christianization of China. I remember thinking then we were really in trouble. It's before I knew this background, which is now coming out. Dissenters like Wallace were labeled communists and ceased to engage meaningfully in public life. An ancestral voice in his own time, he spoke on May 21st, 1947. Today, in blind fear of communism, we are turning aside from the United Nations. We are approaching a century of fear. And thus far, he's proved to be half right. On July 26, 1947, Congress enacted the National Security Act, which created the National Security Council, still going strong, and the Central Intelligence Agency, still apparently going over a cliff as the result of decades of bad intelligence, not to mention all those cheery traitors for whom the country club at Langley, Virginia was once an impenetrable cover.